In his book, The Greatest Generation, Tom Brokaw, the famous journalist, pays special tribute to our World War II veterans for the example they showed in courage, sacrifice, and honor. Theirs was a time of immense peril when the democracies of the world were on the precipice of annihilation. The mission of our armed forces continue, and in more recent years they are having to go to different parts of the world, other regions, to uphold the freedoms we so enjoy. For my project, We the People, Portraits of Veterans in America, I spent 7 years traveling to all 50 states in the country to paint one veteran from every state. I painted them of all ages, our World War II veterans, down to the youngest at 20 years old. All of them, in their own way and in their own place of history, they too showed their fine examples of courage, sacrifice, and honor. And all of them taught me what it means to be an American. I spent my career as an artist. It's what I've always done. It's always what I've only known how to do. And for many years, I've always painted portraits of people. My most recent project before this was called Working South, in which I painted people in the vanishing industries, blue-collar workers of the South. And as that touring exhibition was coming to a close, I thought, well, what's my next act going to be? What if I do something even bigger, grander, bigger in scope? What if I went to all 50 states of this country and painted a real portrait of America today? Not as we hope it to be, but as it truly is, showing our great diversity. But then the problem became immediate to me, like, how do I choose? How do I possibly choose just one veteran from every state? One person. And that's when I knew that it had to be our veterans, because otherwise, what makes a person most American? I mean, would they have had to have been born here? Did they have to be registered to vote? Did they win the 4th grade spelling bee? Do they eat turkey on Thanksgiving? And that's when I knew for sure it had to be a project about our veterans, because I believe that our greatest Americans, our greatest patriots, are anyone willing to lay down their life for our country, our veterans. So a project was born, We the People, Portraits of Veterans in America. It was a project that would take me over 7 years to do, in which I did almost entirely in secret. I self-funded the project, and for the most part I traveled by myself to every state. Most of the time I traveled in my car, but at other times I traveled by taxi and Uber and bus. I also traveled by airplane and helicopter. I traveled by 16-wheeler, pickup truck, speedboat, cruise ship, and one very, very slow golf cart. My mission was to paint everyone in America, everyone from the top down, and in my mind that was to paint an astronaut all the way down to a homeless person and everyone in between, including a tattoo artist, maybe a dairy farmer, a lobsterman, a teacher, a nurse, all of the Americans, so that when you could bring all of these paintings together, you could say, yes, that's America. That is all of us. So the first thing I did, I drew out a map of the United States and I taped it to this wall of my studio. And as I would go visit a veteran in one of the states and get the photographs I needed and the sketches and the notes, I would color in that state in yellow. And then after I'd finished the painting, I would color it in red. And so to get to the veterans, to find the veterans, that wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. I mean, for instance, it might be easy to find a trucker, but to find a trucker that's also a veteran and a woman, for instance, that took me almost 20 to 25 phone calls to different trucking companies. So I found that I had to go on the internet a lot to research, and I found as a great resource small towns, the Chamber of Commerce, where I could roll into a small town and ask, who do you have that's a veteran in this town, and what kind of jobs do they have? And for instance, finding out someone who was a falconer, at Falconer in Idaho. Who knew? And that's a real job. And so I painted one of the veterans as a falconer. I knew that I would have to include in this project, among the others, I would have to include someone who is homeless. Because on any given night in this country, there are 40,000 homeless veterans in this country. And so I knew that I'd have to find one homeless person that I could paint. And I did. Out in California, near Carmel, I found Dennis, who was living in a tarp under the woods up in the forest near Carmel with his dog. So I actually hired two guides, a man and a woman who were also homeless and who knew the woods well, and they guided me up into the forest. I had a backpack. I carried my camera and my sketchbook and a bag of dog food because I knew that Dennis lived with his dog under this tarp. And I met Dennis, and as I did with all the veterans, I asked them, about their time in the military, what their life was like. And for Dennis, he told me that most of his life he had been homeless. But he said, Mary, the single best and the only good thing I ever did was join the military. And so the painting I did of him was challenging because I knew that I needed to also address PTSD because some of our veterans do suffer from this. And so this was a painting that I actually did over 3 times. The first couple of times I painted Dennis with his dog, with the tents and the laundry hanging on the clothesline behind them. But it just looked like an old guy camping. So I needed to address this PTSD, this idea of mental trauma. So I've depicted him in this painting kind of leaning over with a splatter of red coming out away from him. Other veterans were also a challenge to get to. I mean, here was a project and I needed to get to all 50 states and be able to fund it as well. For instance, to get to Alaska, I actually conducted a workshop on one of the cruise ships leaving out of Vancouver and going up the Inside Passage. And I had taught the class on the ship, and during the day we had the class in one of the restaurants, and then one afternoon when the ship had come into port, the port of Skagway, Alaska, when the students and the guests all got off and went in one direction, I went the other direction to the post office in town, where I met with Adrian. We had pre-planned this visit, who was currently the postmaster of this very small town. And so she let me follow her around with a camera and a sketchbook and photograph her. And I said, Adrian, I want the most beat up box for you to put on your shoulder. And she laughed and she said, well, Mary, this is the United States Post Office. We don't exactly like to show those off. But in the painting, I've got her with this box on her shoulder, almost like Rosie, the famous painting, World War II painting of Rosie the Riveter, looking off to the side with great strength. To do these paintings, I had to start by doing sketches. All of these paintings are done in watercolor, and many of them are actually quite large. And as some of you may know, as you're watching this, that watercolor is tricky business. That you basically get one shot at it. And it's because it's the only medium that relies strictly on timing. So to do this, I have to start with sketches. And I go to the people that I'm painting. I do sketches on the spot. I take photographs as well. But overall, I work from 4 sources as an artist. Working from life would be ideal. I would love it if Adrian could have stood there that whole time with the box on her shoulder, but I know that isn't always possible, particularly when I'm painting people that are busy at work. So I also have to rely on photographs. And I get as many photographs as I can because I want to be able to remember small details such as what they were wearing or something that was in the background. But I also work from memory, remembering things like, well, was that veteran exhausted or was the veteran exuberant, and something that might have happened or appeared in the background. And then imagination. Imagination being what might have happened, or what might have been at that moment. For instance, in the painting of the lobsterman, that perhaps a rogue wave might have come over of the boat at that moment, or with the painting of the boxing trainer. In real life, she was positioned against a white wall, but I thought, what if I paint her against a wall that is a fiery red so that I can show the heat of it? So all of these paintings, none of them were exactly what I saw, but all of them were exactly what I felt. And my job as an artist, all of us as artists, is to show the viewer what we feel and hopefully to bring them into our world and show them something that perhaps they haven't seen before. I was able to meet with a lot of World War II veterans, the oldest being in their mid-90s, and to hear their stories about their time in the military and life after their time in the military. One of the veterans, the World War II veterans that I met, that was Amelia from Savannah, Georgia, in a painting that I call Glory. During her time in the military, Amelia was commanding post offices for the Tuskegee Airmen. That was her job. And it was until, of course, years later when I met her and was able to find her in her small home near Savannah. And when I met with Amelia, I asked her the same questions that I asked all of the veterans, and that was, what was the best part of being in the military, and what was the worst part of being in the military? And for many of them, they said the best part was this camaraderie and this chance to travel around the country. And for the worst part, of course, you can imagine it was these times of conflict. When I met with Amelia, I was able to sit at her feet and hear her tell me about her stories during World War II. And at one point, she actually put her hand over her heart and she said, "The Pledge of Allegiance." And then also she sang for me, I think it was our national anthem. She sang it for me. And I remember sitting there at her feet, looking up at her. And I remember the hair actually standing up on the back of my head and thinking, this is how I want to paint her. This moment, as though perhaps she's rising up out of her seat. And certainly that's how I felt that I was, as though, this voice singing. Another World War II veteran I met was in Hawaii on the island of Maui. Hiroshi, a Japanese American, who told me that right after Pearl Harbor was bombed, he tried to enlist, but he was turned away because of his Japanese American heritage. And it wasn't until a full year had gone by before he was able to enlist in the Army. And when I was visiting with Hiroshi, we sat in his backyard, in his garden, underneath the trees there. And he sat with his hands on his lap, facing away from me, but with great serenity. And I knew that was partly how I wanted to paint him. And it wasn't until later that afternoon I was driving along the highway there, and I looked down over the edge at the waves washing up, and there was this huge tree trunk, this grand piece of driftwood that had washed up onto shore. And I thought, that's how I'm going to paint Hiroshi. So I scrambled down. I was able to get a few photos of this tree trunk. And so that's how I painted him, sitting on this tree trunk, as though this tree trunk was like a wave coming up over him. But in the painting I did of Hiroshi, it was really this small, tiny wave in the background, and you can barely see it in the painting. To me, that's the true portrait of Hiroshi. This one small wave, this one small person coming from another country to ours, to fight for our country and to uphold the values that we so cherish here in the United States. The veterans taught me many things along the way in this project over 7 years. And from them I learned, for instance, the importance of a cause greater than self. And this was something that I saw over and over again from our veterans in their work and in their jobs. And for instance, I went to see a barber in Tennessee, and I spent the day in the barber shop, and I watched him with his clients, and with such enormous respect. And all of these veterans, no matter where they were, all of them seemed to work for this cause greater than self, always doing what was right, whether it went unrecognized or unrecorded. I saw this over and over again, even with the veterans that may have been encountering difficulties in their lives. One of the veterans that I painted had been homeless at one time. She'd come from South America with her 2 children and came here so that she could join the military and give her children a better life than she had known. And for a while, she served in the military, building barracks. And then after she got out, unfortunately, she was homeless for a bit and was in a homeless shelter when I found her in Houston. And she told me that while she was there at the homeless shelter, she looked out the window and she could see a block or 2 away there were houses being built. And that was a skill that she had learned in the military. So she walked over there and was given a job in construction, a job that she still works for today. And she said to me that her main goal was that someday she was going to build her own house as well. I saw this over and over again, this wanting to work for a cause greater than self. But there's more that I learned too from these veterans. And that was never letting fear stop you. This I would see in the way they worked and in their stories. And it wasn't that they weren't ever afraid. It's just that they never let fear stop them. Many of these paintings are large in this series of 50 paintings. And for the most part, I work upright. But every now and then I do also work when I have to work flat on the floor. In other words, when I need to put a big pass of a wash down quickly, and I don't want it to move too fast, in which I have to put down this wash. And in one case, one of the panels I did was actually 10 feet long, and that was of an astronaut. That was Winston Scott, who, when I found him, he was at NASA. And during his time there, Winston had done 3 spacewalks. When I was talking with Winston at NASA, I asked him, what was it like, doing 3 spacewalks? Because obviously I wanted to do this painting as though you're looking out the window of this spaceship, and he's out there just coming back to the ship. But of course I can't be there in person, so I had to go on what he was telling me. And I remember saying, Winston, weren't you ever scared out there? And he said, Mary, no, we had a job to do. We were too well trained to be scared. The veterans that I painted came from such diverse backgrounds, different parts of the country, all ages, all 5 branches of the military. Such interesting jobs that they had. One of them that I met, a young woman, Sarah, worked at the zoo in Indiana. Her job was to take care of the sea lions. And when I would go to a location to paint one of the veterans, I like to walk around the area and take a look, and so I can get an idea, when there isn't anyone else around, how I want to paint that particular person. So I was able to get into the zoo early to walk around, and when I walked by the huge tank where the sea lions are in, they quickly swam by me, but not knowing who I was, they just kind of went, yeah, and went right by. But when Sarah showed up later with a bucket of fish, when they saw her and she started tossing the fish over the top of the tank, they churned up the waters and they practically danced on top of the water for her. And there's this churning and spinning, which is, I wanted to capture that in the painting. But then afterwards, when their bellies were now full, they slowed down and it became this kind of this dance as they were going past her and swing by. And I said, so Sarah, this is what I want you to do. I want you to sit down and lean up, put your head back and close your eyes, so that I could do this large painting called Swim. Other veterans that I met, one, I knew that I wanted to do a firefighter, and I was able to find Casey in Bend, Oregon. Casey had served, and when I later talked with him, he also was redeployed back to Afghanistan. When I was painting Casey, I asked him, what's it like, when you're out there? I mean, after a fire, aren't you guys all hot and sweaty and sooty? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, that's really how I want to paint you. So I remember at the time I took dumped some water on a paper towel and I put it on his head, and I had some charcoal in my drawing bag that I rubbed on my hands, and I rubbed it on his face, and that was the look that I wanted. And then I had him pose as if he was exhausted. What I didn't know then, and I found out later, was that he had been redeployed back to Afghanistan. And in that time, he saw the worst of what mankind can do to another, including witnessing the loss of his best friend. And so today, Casey is back as a firefighter, but he has to travel with his dog, his service dog, that he named after his best friend that he lost in battle. So when I meet these veterans, when I would meet them on location, sometimes I would have an idea of how I would want to paint them, but other times it was just there on location that I would see something happen or learn something about them, and I would think, that's the feeling, that's what I want to capture in this painting. I knew too that I wanted to include in this series a Native American. And so in South Dakota, I found Kela, who does traditional Lakota dancing in her full regalia. And when I met her, she actually put on the full regalia for me. This gorgeous hand-beaded outfit that she wore. A lot of it had been beaded by her husband. And if you look carefully at her, you can actually see bald eagles and little American flags across the shoulder and down the arm and on her footwear. And she was so pure in this that I thought the best way for me to paint her, to drive this home, would be to put her in an alley where it's very gritty and there was trash, and she'd be surrounded by graffiti on the wall. And so the painting is called America. One of the other World War II veterans that I painted was Hank from New Jersey. Hank had served in World War II on the Coast Guard. When I asked Hank, what was the best thing about being in the military, he said everything. He absolutely loved it. He loved the friends, he loved the travel, and he especially loved the time off when they would go take the train to Baltimore and go dancing, because according to Hank, Baltimore had the prettiest girls. When I went to visit Hank to paint him, I thought I would paint him puttering around in his backyard garden where he managed to grow tomatoes as big as bowling balls. They were huge, these tomatoes that he would grow. But he would come up to me, and this face would come up right up to me, this big smiling face. And I thought, this is how I'm going to paint him. This face in my face, showing the dappled light coming through, all the detail, the blood vessels in his eyes, the hair in his nose, the stubble on his cheek, that's how I was going to paint him. And so I knew that we wanted to bring in all these veterans to see this opening exhibition that happened in Charleston, South Carolina, but that some of the veterans wouldn't be able to come, either because of their work or perhaps because of physical constraints. And we knew that Hank was one of those veterans who wasn't going to be able to come to the opening. So we took the painting to Hank. We actually got a great big huge RV driven by my friend Tommy McQueenie, and also driven by several veterans that volunteered. And we drove up several paintings to some of the other veterans, and this large painting called Tomato Pie to show to Hank. And when he was there, we unveiled it to him, because none of the veterans saw their paintings before they went up for the opening of the exhibition. And when he was there, and he would tell us these stories, and by now his friends were all gone that he had served with, and most of the people that he knew, and he actually got kind of wistful, and he grew quiet, and I said, Hank, would you like to dance? And so he started to rise up on his walker, and the family, he'd just fallen the day before, and they're all afraid that Hank is going to fall again. And no, Hank got up, and he held on to me, and I held on to him, and he hummed, and we danced. So it's never let fear stop you. So when this show finally went up, when the paintings were all done, and the book was done, and the paintings went up, and we started the foundation, the Patriot Art Foundation. That all happened, the foundation happened, after I began meeting the veterans who came to see their paintings, and veterans just to see the paintings in general. And it was their reaction to these paintings, them telling me their stories of how just viewing these paintings, of maybe people they didn't know, but to see these paintings, to be able to walk in and see them and say, yes, I mattered. That their reaction is really what moved me to start the Patriot Art Foundation. Whose mission is to give veterans a way to tell their own stories through art, to give them a source of connection, of purpose, and a source of expression. It taught me just what art can do. There were many things that these veterans taught me through this project, and I really came out the one greater for it. And the three things that they taught me was certainly the importance of having a cause greater than self. Also that to never let fear stop you. I learned that over and over again with them at times when I thought, I don't know if I can finish this project, but keeping in mind them always moving ahead and never letting fear stopping them. And that always to do the right thing. But also, I think the third thing that I learned from them and from doing this project was how wonderful this country really is. What a great country we really have, and how beautiful it really is. That if you asked me, did I have a favorite state in this country, I'd have to say no, because all of them have areas of amazing beauty. And these veterans that were truly always surprising me, and such extraordinary, extraordinary people. And from them too, I also learned that the principles on which this country was founded, these freedoms, our democracy, are still worth fighting for. This is still something that's important. Something that all of us can do in different ways, even if we're not in the military. That we can do this by engaging at the voting booth, serving on the school board, volunteering in different ways in our communities. Even if it's just buying 50 boxes of Girl Scout cookies, we too can commit to a cause greater than self and help to uphold the freedoms in this country. It wasn't until I actually finished this project that I realized in many parts of this world, in many countries, I could not have done this. Being a woman, traveling by myself, painting what I wanted to paint, all with the expression and hope of making a better life for myself. And so it's really because of our veterans that I have them to thank for this. So it is true that perhaps we owe a lot to our World War II veterans. And as Tom Brokaw said in his book, The Greatest Generation, for what they displayed to us, for their great courage and sacrifice and honor. But it's what I learned from all of our veterans, all of them that I met and that I painted and that I spoke with, that all of our vets, all of our veterans are the greatest of their generation.